Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Best-selling novelist Allegra Goodman's latest, Isola, is an epic saga about a French noblewoman deserted on an island where her survival depends on the power of her faith and love. Heir to a fortune, Marguerite is destined for a life of prosperity and gentility. Then she is orphaned, and her guardian, an enigmatic and volatile man, spends her inheritance and insists she accompany him on an expedition to New France. That journey takes an unexpected turn when Marguerite, accused of betrayal, is brutally punished and abandoned on a small island. Inspired by the real life of a 16th century heroine, Isola is a timeless story of a woman fighting for survival. Allegra Goodman is the author of 6 novels, including the national bestseller Sam. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Allegra Goodman to this week's book show. How are you?
I'm good. Good to be here.
A delight to have you on the program. Thank you very much for being with us. My understanding is this novel has been in you for a very long time, even going back to Sam.
Yes, I got the idea for it many years ago. I stumbled across the story of Marguerite in a children's book about Canadian history that I had taken with me in a big stack of books from the library on a trip up to Canada with my children. And I had thought about sharing, reading these books with my boys who were 10, 7, and 3 at the time, but they were not interested. But I ended up reading all of the books because I was nursing our newborn baby and I was up all night with her. In a book about Jacques Cartier and his expeditions to Canada, I stumbled across Marguerite in a parenthetical statement, as women's history often is within male history. And I thought at the time, oh my gosh, what a great subject for a novel. But it was not until that little baby went off to college that I ended up writing the book.
How much was there out there about Marguerite and ultimately what happened?
When I started getting this idea that I would actually write it, I started reading a lot and I read everything I could find. So she was relatively famous in her own lifetime as a survivor. And there were 2 contemporary accounts of her ordeal that I read, and you can get them in English. One was by the Queen of Navarre, who was the sister of the King of France, who collected what she called true stories in a book called, which was published after her death, called the Heptameron. And the story of Marguerite and her ordeal on the island is, I think, story number 69 in that collection, which you can get in English and in French. And then the other account of her ordeal was by a priest who said that he interviewed her. But the 2 accounts conflict with each other, and they're also very brief. They're about 2 pages long each. So there was a lot of space for me as a novelist to imagine what happened to her.
In starting the story and to bringing us to this place, it takes us a while to get to the island in the novel, and that is was fascinating to me because it's such a rich backstory and history of this woman, and really sets up her character and who she is and why she is capable of surviving, and especially during such adverse circumstances.
Yes, I did that on purpose. I could have started, page 1. She is on a boat, dropped off at the island, and left there. That would have been one natural place to start the story. But I was interested in that backstory that you were talking about and establishing who she was and what her circumstances were, also her relationship with her guardian and why she ended up on the island. And one of the reasons that I spent that time with the reader doing that was so that the reader could see just how shocking it was for her to end up in that place. For her, it was like going to the moon to go to an island like that. And this is a woman who is a noble woman who had been waited on hand and foot all her life, had probably never even dressed herself, and let alone used a knife or a musket or cleaned a fish or scrambled up an icy slope. I wanted the reader to see that contrast and just how shocking that would be, and what it really meant for her to end up there.
And as far as her background, she is, as you say, she's well taken care of. She has everything, and yet there is a confidence that she has at the core. It certainly grows as time goes on, but a confidence that is there from the very beginning.
Yeah, she has a confident spirit, and which she's going to need. She's also a healthy young woman. She's
Yep.
about 20 when she ends up on the island, and you can't be frail in those sorts of circumstances. When I had the idea for this, I really thought of it as like a female Robinson Crusoe story. The thing is that it's a real survival story, so she had to be healthy and she was tested physically, on the island. But then the thing to remember also is that Robinson Crusoe was on sort of a semi-tropical island where the sun beat down and it was very sunny. She's in a subarctic climate where just not freezing to death is a huge challenge during the winter.
Allegra Goodman is our guest on this week's book show, and the new novel is Isola, and it is published by the Dial Press. When it comes to her guardian, of that relationship, because this character ultimately becomes the villain of the book, right?
Yeah.
So, what's it like to create that villain?
He's a tricky guy, her guardian. So he is a mercurial man, very changeable. He has a temper. He's also knowledgeable. He is a wonderful musician. He's also religious. He's a devout person, but he can be very cruel. And he treats her like his property. One of the scariest things about him, I think, is that he lives in a society that allows him to be like this, that he's actually typical of men of his station at his time and his views towards women and everything. So, he's typical rather than being an outlier, a monster. He has no checks on him, legal or otherwise.
So, his behavior is expected in many ways.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that he definitely exploits the situation, but it's certainly, there's no way to stop him. Now, how was it to write him? I think it was a lot of fun to write a villain, actually. And like, I was fascinated by his character and also by his psychological manipulations of her. He's very, very scary, partly because he's so unpredictable. And that was something that was very interesting to write. I experimented with different ways of writing him and ended up with this very unpredictable, tricky, tricky guy.
And without giving anything away, but he is surprising and to the very end is not doing what you would expect him to do and behave the way he would behave, and also not just to the heroine of this story, but to other characters as well.
Yes, he is surprising. And that is actually wonderful to write somebody who's so surprising. And she has to be very strong to withstand him and also smart and patient.
I guess this is a question of what you knew from history and what you knew and what you created. But when she goes to the island, did you know for sure who she went with?
In the Queen's account of her going to the island, she goes with her husband, and I think it's just her husband. And in the priest's account, she goes with her husband and her lover and her servant. So it's a little bit different story. And I went with the latter. I had her go with those two. And that's actually was very interesting to me as a writer because a lot of castaway stories, it's usually the person starts off alone. There's a shipwreck and like Robinson Crusoe climbs out of the ocean, or Gulliver, he's alone in the land of Lilliputians, etc. But she starts out with two people. And I was very interested in that, what it was like to be on an island with two others and to work together to try to survive. And then again, I don't want to give too much away, but she ends up alone. She ends up very alone. And I wanted to show that transition and how scary that was for her to finally really be isolated, what that isolation meant for her spiritually, emotionally, and just practically as the sole survivor.
It comes as a loss of everything.
A loss of everything. And this is a person who has been cared for by her nurse Stamian since she was born. And she even reflects at one point that she's never even slept in a bed alone, ever. Like she's just never been alone in her life. She's always had servants around her, people around her, companions. And so she has to learn how to be with herself, to live with herself.
I was fascinated by the nurse character because this is a woman who is also very religious, is a nurse figure, a mother figure in many
Yeah.
ways to Marguerite.
She's the only mother Marguerite ever knew because her mother died when she was born in childbirth. And I was interested in the nurse being a woman of faith, of having this sort of rock solid faith no matter what happens, which is in contrast to Marguerite, who really struggles with doubts. And there's a tension there and a dialogue there between them. And, Marguerite learns from the nurse and admires her and grows to understand her in new ways, as one does as you get older.
And I assume even that could be said for the nurse too, of understanding the
Yes,
horrible circumstances that this young woman is in.
for sure. I would say their relationship evolves in the book, and it's a central relationship in the book.
Were you always beholden to the facts of the story in the sense of, I mean, you knew where you were going to go ultimately, right?
Yeah.
And how it was going to, as far as the basic facts of how it was going
Yes.
to end.
Yes, I knew those basic facts, so I worked around those facts. Some of the facts in the middle, people didn't know. People don't know exactly Marguerite's relationship with her guardian, except that he was her kinsman. So I had them be cousins. People don't know exactly why, he left her on the island, although, there are these conflicting accounts. So I chose one, but I had these sort of guidelines, and it also helped me structure the novel in terms of the voyage out. And it is really a classic Odyssey or a quest tale, or sort of archetypal. She goes out and she goes to this new place, not only in physically but also in her mind and in her spirit, and then she returns. She's broken by this experience and then she's remade. And as a novelist, I really enjoyed writing about somebody's evolution and somebody's growth in that way.
Is it freeing to know how it ends in the sense of that your job is to get everybody there?
Definitely freeing, yes. Other books I've written, I have to figure out where the end point is.
Sure.
So with a historical novel where you have a few facts to go on, I think actually that is freeing. It's sort of like having some of the puzzle pieces in place, and then you have to figure out the rest, but you have those clues.
When it comes to the living on the island of that experience, what research was involved for you to learn about skinning a bear, working with the fish,
Yeah.
figuring all of that out?
Yeah. Well, I did a lot of reading. I did a lot of thinking, and I also watched like films of there. You can get like footage of these islands in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. I thought a lot about the climate, about the weather. I looked at, videos of polar bears. I actually have books about polar bears and how they behave and how they hunt. And I looked at that. I looked at videos of how to load a musket and how to fire it, which I didn't know about before. And actually, I did it recently an email exchange with Emma Donahue, who's also a historical novelist, and
Yes.
we talked about our research processes, and she talked about like she likes to look at YouTube videos, and I was like, "Oh yeah, it's such a great resource." She said it's actually really helpful to sort of see things broken down visually like that, and I totally agree.
Upcoming guest who will be talking about her novel Paris Express, which is
Yes.
very exciting. But it's interesting to me that when you have this woman, and again, there are various times where she's alone and with others, that it's still very much a lot of this on her most of the time to figure these things out.
Yeah, I was really interested in that. It sort of like makes you think, would I have the strength to do what she did, or to keep going, even knowing that she might not survive? It's hard to keep up hope in a circumstance like that. And I was interested in sort of where she would find that strength and that faith and that hope to keep going. What would inspire her? So these are great questions to explore in fiction.
Do you have a sense of even what her limitations were, whether that was what was in your mind as the writer, or that what you wanted to share with the reader?
Her limitations, like physically, or
Yes, limitations of what she would do. I mean, were there rules that you set up and said, okay, well, I'm not going to go this far, but I would like to go here and explore this?
I felt like when she was on the island, there was nothing that she wouldn't do to survive unless she gave up
Yes.
hope altogether. And she goes through a lot of loss and she grieves and she thinks about giving up. And I wanted to explore that. But when she tries to survive, I showed her doing everything that she could. Her limitations are that she might run out of gunpowder, that she might freeze, that she might not be able to hunt successfully. She could wound herself or fall ill and nobody would help her. It's hard to imagine for us in our networked world just how isolated she was. This was at a time when nobody sailed over there. She could not hail a passing ship. There were no passing ships for her. This is, almost 100 years before the Pilgrims went to Plymouth. Cartier had done these voyages, and again, it was like space travel for them. It was really the end of the world.
When she was banished to the island, how aware was her cousin of what indeed the situation that he was putting them into, which I assume was ultimately to for them to be doomed.
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt in my mind that he did not expect them to come out alive. When I was doing research for this book, I looked at other voyages of the period, and one of the explorers was Magellan, and he actually marooned some people who acted out on his ship. And there was no question in people's mind that these people were going to starve and die, even though they might be left with provisions. So yeah, the expectation was that she would not come out of this alive, and that's part of the drama of her story.
Allegra Goodman is our guest. The name of the new novel is Isola, and it is published by the Dial Press. Tell us about the title, Isola.
So I came up with the title towards the end of writing the first draft. I was thinking about different titles. I didn't really have one, but I had a map in mind that was the first map of this area in North America, which was an Italian map, which I think was probably based on some of the explorations that Cartier had done. He'd done these three voyages. And the map is actually reproduced in the first pages of the
Hmm.
of the novel. And it's a beautiful map. It sort of became a famous map, and it was reprinted many times in atlases and stuff. But you can see in the map there's this large white area in the west that is just blank because they didn't know what was there at that point. And it says part incognita. Everything in the map is labeled in Italian, and that literally means parts unknown. And then in the ocean part of the map, where the Gulf of St. Lawrence is, you can see these little rocky islands, and each of them is Isola, which is the Italian word for island. And I started looking at that Italian word and thinking it was so evocative because it means island, but it also, if you look at it too long, it looks like you can see I and then sola, like solo, like I alone, but in the feminine, with the
Mm.
A on the end. To me, it captured that sense of isolation of island, and then she's alone, completely alone. And she says at one point in the book that she herself became an island while she was on the island, that she herself, in her isolation, in her loneliness, became like an island. I just thought the word was very evocative, and that's why I used it for the title.
You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that she was quite famous for her time of people knowing the story and being aware of it. How did she handle that?
I wish I could say she left no, documents of her own. There are no diaries or letters that she wrote. There's nothing in her own voice. So I'm guessing that, in my version, in my mind, I think that she did well with that, like that her story became currency for her in a way. After losing her fortune, her story maybe became her fortune.
Right. Well, and I asked the question because we mentioned earlier of her confidence, but there is a great pride that comes of what it is like to endure that
Yeah.
for as long as she did.
Yeah. And I explore that a bit in my book, but of course, that is from my imagination. We don't have any statement by her.
Is that frustrating?
No, I think well, it's frustrating, but it's also an opportunity, right?
Yes. Yes. I mean, and that's what I was going to ask you that question. I mean, there is a point where the facts could get in the way, right?
Yeah, I think what happens when you write a novel and you're sort of deeply imagining something is that it becomes very, very real to you. And now she is completely real to me. And the way I've written her, it's all of a piece. And her world is totally tangible to me. So I completely I believe in my creation, I should say.
It's a very different novel for you, especially as far as the subject. And you described how you got there, but and it did take a while for you to get there. Was it a leap of faith at some point that said, "Okay, this is the time that I do this now"?
I think honestly, it was when I was writing Sam, which is this very contemporary novel about a 21st century girl. who
Right.
thinks and speaks and acts in very modern contemporary ways. She's a boulderer and she climbs, and she's always climbing these rocky boulders that we have in New England. And I think writing about her and her bouldering and the way she tried to survive made me think about Marguerite and sort of cast my mind back to this idea. And I ended up writing Isola at the same time as I was writing Sam. So I would describe the process as this kind of time travel. And as you know, the books are incredibly different in their voice and
Hmm.
their attitude and the diction of the language and everything. But I was doing one in the morning and one in the afternoon, and it was this incredibly interesting, fruitful time when I was doing both. And they were both about young women dealing with certain challenges of their society and both coming into their own. And so that was very, very interesting.
Does one take over at some point where it ultimately has to win out for your attention?
No, no, it wasn't quite like that. It was sort of like they weren't quite at the same stage. So I was much farther along in Sam when I was working on Isola.
Okay.
So I was working on them at the same time. And I usually do the harder thing in the morning because I'm a morning person and the easier thing in the afternoon. So when I got Sam to the point that it was getting easier, I switched Sam into the afternoon slot and moved Isola into the primary morning slot. So it wasn't, so I was still working full bore on both of them, but they were in slightly different stages.
What is it like to have those two different, it seems like they're very set sessions of different times of day where you're working on different projects. I don't know how many authors I've talked to that work that way.
Yeah, it was kind of crazy. It was really interesting. It's something that I sort of discovered about myself that I work slowly and I'm a gradualist, but I'm very steady. So I work very gradually every day. And I'm not the sort of person who can work a whole day through on one project, but I did discover that I would get a second win in the afternoon and be able to work on something different. So if you want to think of it more in theatrical terms, it was like being in a repertory company in my mind where I was playing different parts in the morning and the afternoon.
Right. One, the Shakespeare,
Yeah.
the comedy, and then to the tragedy.
Well, yes.
Or however
Yeah.
you look at the books, and then to switch over is also interesting too, because that has to be a real commitment to say, okay, it's time to do this now.
It was a commitment and it definitely was work, but it was also play and it was something I was excited to do. It was sort of like when I was working on Sam, it was my official project and I had a contract for the book and everything. And this was my stealth project that I was doing on the side and I didn't tell anyone about it. And that I also enjoyed. So I was alone on the island with Marguerite in the afternoons.
What is the benefit of that? I mean, you again make the decision that you're not going to tell anyone about it. Was that to protect you, to protect the story, to protect
Yeah, to
Marguerite?
protect the story. I thought this is different. This is new for me. It's a different kind of book. I'm just gonna give myself the luxury of working on this in silence without anyone asking questions about it until I'm done. And I didn't confess that I was working on it for about 18 months to anyone. I didn't tell my family, didn't tell my husband. I just worked on it by myself. It was actually a great way to work. I really owned that project.
Do you feel like you're sneaking off to do it?
A little bit, yeah. It was sort of like I was cheating on Sam a little bit when I was working on Isola.
With that said, of these very different projects, and I understand being protective of it, especially given that it is different. When Sam comes out and is received the way it's received, then do you say to yourself, "Oh, wait till they find out what's coming next"?
Yes, in my optimistic moments, I did say that. I was like, "Oh boy, wait." But I was also very nervous about it. And I remember being very, very worried about telling my agent about Isola. I sort of blurted out, "I have written another novel and well, it's set in the 16th century." There was kind of this long pause. She's like, "Okay." So I was nervous. At the same time, I enjoyed surprising her.
And once you do that, in whatever estate the next book is in, whether you want to share that or not, I mean, it's that we as a reader can really now expect almost anything from you,
Yeah.
which
I
is a
like
neat
that.
place to be. Yeah.
Yes, yes. I don't see any reason to limit if I can do it, I'm going to do it. I don't want to limit myself. Yeah. So yeah, expect the unexpected. That's what I would tell the readers.
Does the lore of history bring you back to the point of something that you say that this is a nice way to have this origin story?
I'm really interested in history and I could see myself writing another historical novel. So definitely stay tuned. But I also really committed to writing contemporary books. And my new book that's going to be published in 2026 is about a contemporary American family and it's set in like 2015. So
And when you look at that and you say, did you work on that solely, or were you working on something else while you were doing that as well?
actually that's something I've been working on over time and I was even working on it during the time I was working on these two books. But I was writing it sort of piecemeal and so parts of it have been published in the New Yorker sort of saga of this family, but that's been a long gradual project over years.
When you finish this story, there's such a lovely moment, and everything just feels right about it. And I'm curious as to, was that a natural place for you, or did you really have to work to get to that?
Oh, thank you so much for mentioning that. I actually worked really hard on that ending. I had an ending. I knew where I wanted to be. It was sort of, I knew where I wanted to go with it. I knew where she was going to be leaving the castle and everything, but I didn't quite know how to say it. And I spent days and weeks and dreamed about it and woke up in the middle of the night thinking about that ending. So I'm so glad you think it felt right because I did feel after quite a lot of work that I did get there.
Right. And it felt right for the character. I felt right
Mm,
for this woman, and what she did, and what she was able to do,
thank you.
especially with for those around her. The name of the novel is Isola. It is published by the Dial Press. Allegra Goodman, what a great pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you so much for sharing with us. An absolute delight.
Oh, thank you so much for talking to me.
Allegra Goodman's new novel is Isola. It is published by the Dial Press. Thanks to our producer, Sarah LeDuc. Write to us at book@wamc.org. The latest on National Productions programs is available via the Airwaves newsletter at wamc.org and on social media at WAMC Radio. Bookmark us for next week, and thanks for listening for The Book Show. I'm Joe Donahue.